The fog that rolls off the Hudson River in late October is not like other fog. It doesn't drift, it clings. It wraps around the ancient oaks and the wrought iron gates of the estates in Westchester County like a damp shroud, muting the world, hiding the sins of the people who live behind the high stone walls. On the night of October 30th, 1974, that fog was particularly thick around the perimeter of the Eyrie, the sprawling Gothic revival estate belonging to the Vane family. To the outside world, the Vanes were American royalty. Cornelius Vane, the patriarch, was a 6-term senator, a kingmaker who could end a political career with a phone call or start a war with a signature. His children were the golden offspring of the East Coast elite, splashed across the society pages of the New York Times, smiling, charitable, untouchable. But the cameras never went past the foyer. The journalists never saw what happened in the East Wing after the press junkets ended. If they had, they would have seen that the Vane dynasty wasn't built on democracy or public service. It was built on a foundation of control so absolute, so suffocating that it bordered on a cult. And on this specific night, the eve of Halloween, the Eyrie was preparing for a wedding that felt less like a celebration of love and more like a transfer of livestock. Lucinda Vane stood by the window of her third-floor bedroom, watching the limousines begin to snake up the long gravel driveway. She was 22 years old, with the kind of pale, fragile beauty that painters obsess over and predators exploit. She was wearing a wedding dress that cost more than most American families earned in a decade, a confection of French lace and seed pearls. But her hands, resting on the cold glass, were trembling with a frequency that rattled the diamond engagement ring on her finger. She wasn't shaking from excitement. She was shaking because she knew the script. She had played this role before, twice. Her first husband, a banking heir named John Sterling, had died in a sailing accident off Martha's Vineyard 3 months after the wedding. The police report said he had been drunk, that he had slipped and hit his head before falling overboard. But Lucinda remembered the bruises on his arm the week before he died. She remembered the way her brother, Julian, had looked at him across the dinner table. A look devoid of anger, devoid of humanity. A look that simply calculated the geometry of a problem that needed to be removed. Her second husband, a rising diplomat, had overdosed on heroin in a hotel room in D.C. A tragic accident, the paper said. A secret vice. But Lucinda knew he hated needles. She knew he was terrified of drugs. And she knew that he had been planning to move her to London, away from the suffocating grip of her father. He tried to take the asset away from the firm, and the firm liquidated him. Now, there was Thomas Reed, the young, idealistic district attorney of Albany, the man who was supposed to be the future of the party. He was handsome, ambitious, and completely oblivious to the fact that he wasn't walking down an aisle. He was walking into a meat grinder. The door to Lucinda's bedroom opened. She didn't turn around. She knew the cadence of those footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, ownership. "You look like a ghost, Lucy," a voice said. It was Julian Vane. Julian was 26, 4 years older than Lucinda, but he seemed ancient. He had their father's shark-like grin and eyes that were black holes absorbing all the light in the room. He was the fixer, the enforcer, the shadow that moved behind the senator's bright light. He walked into the room, dressed in a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He held a glass of scotch in one hand and a small velvet box in the other. "Father wants you downstairs in 20 minutes, Julian said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. "The guests are arriving. The governor is here. The bishop is here. Everyone who matters." "I can't do it, Julian," Lucinda whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Thomas, he's a good man. He doesn't know." Julian laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of dry leaves skittering on pavement. He walked over to her, grabbing her shoulder with a hand that felt like an iron clamp. He spun her around. "Good men are the easiest to break," Julian said, his voice dropping to a soothing, terrifying purr. "And you will do it. You will walk down those stairs. You will smile. You will play the blushing bride. Because if you don't, if you embarrass Father tonight, well, you know what happens to things that lose their utility." He opened the velvet box. Inside was a necklace, a choker of rubies, dark as coagulated blood. "Put it on," he ordered. "It hides the pulse in your neck. You look nervous." Lucinda took the necklace. Her fingers felt numb. She fastened it around her throat. The stones were cold. "Good girl," Julian smiled, patting her cheek a little too hard. Tonight isn't just a wedding, Lucy. It's the harvest gala. Father has planned something special. A test for young Thomas, to see if he has the stomach for the family business. Julian turned and walked out, leaving the door open. The sounds of the party drifted up from the grand ballroom below. The clinking of crystal, the murmur of expensive conversation, the string quartet playing Mozart. It sounded civilized. It sounded elegant. But Lucinda knew better. Underneath the Mozart, she could hear the grinding of the gears. The Airy was waking up, and it was hungry. Downstairs, Thomas Reed was handing his coat to a butler who looked like he had been embalmed. Thomas was nervous. Who wouldn't be? He was marrying into the Vane family. It was like marrying into the Mafia, if the Mafia had Ivy League degrees and seats on the stock exchange. He adjusted his tie in the mirror of the foyer. He told himself this was right. He loved Lucinda. She was damaged, yes. She had a sadness about her that drew him in, but he could save her. He could get her out of this gloomy house. He walked into the ballroom. It was a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. The air smelled of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and lilies. Senator Cornelius Vane stood by the fireplace, holding court. He was a massive man with a mane of silver hair and a voice that boomed like a cannon. He saw Thomas and spread his arms wide. "Thomas, my boy," Cornelius shouted, drawing the attention of the entire room. "The man of the hour." Thomas walked over, shaking the senator's hand. It felt like shaking hands with a bear trap. "Senator," Thomas said respectfully, "thank you for everything." "Call me Cornelius," the senator beamed, clapping a heavy hand on Thomas's back. "Tonight, you become family, and family shares everything. Secrets, burdens, triumphs." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of aged brandy. "Have you seen Julian? He has a little surprise for you later, a bachelor party tradition. Just the inner circle." Thomas forced a smile. "I look forward to it, sir." He didn't. He barely tolerated Julian. There was something about the way Julian looked at Lucinda, something possessive, something reptilian, that made Thomas's skin crawl. But he pushed the thought away. He was a Reed. He could handle the Vanes. The ceremony was held in the estate's private chapel, a stone structure attached to the west wing. It was lit by hundreds of candles. The Bishop of New York officiated. It was solemn, beautiful, and utterly devoid of warmth. As Lucinda walked down the aisle, Thomas tried to catch her eye. He wanted to smile at her, to reassure her, but she wouldn't look at him. She stared straight ahead at the altar, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. The ruby choker around her neck looked like a wound. When they said their vows, her voice was a whisper. "I do." It sounded more like a confession than a promise. After the ceremony, the reception began in the great hall. It was lavish. Champagne flowed like water. Waiters moved silently through the crowd with trays of caviar and oysters. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, the atmosphere began to shift. The casual guests, the distant cousins, the junior partners, the press, began to leave. The herd was thinning. Thomas was standing by the bar, loosening his tie, when Julian appeared at his elbow. "Time for the real party, Tom," Julian whispered, his eyes gleaming. "I should check on Lucinda," Thomas said, looking around. "I haven't seen her since the cake cutting." "Lucinda is being prepared," Julian said. "She's waiting for us." "Come, Father is waiting." Julian led Thomas away from the ballroom, down a corridor lined with portraits of dead Vane ancestors. They all seemed to be staring down with the same predatory expression. They reached a set of heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. Two large men in private security uniforms stood guard. They nodded at Julian and opened the doors. Thomas stepped through and stopped. He wasn't in a library or a smoking room. He was in a theater, a private amphitheater-style room with plush velvet seats rising in tiers. In the center, there was a stage, illuminated by a single spotlight. The room was filled with men. Thomas recognized them. The governor, the chief of police, a Supreme Court justice, the titans of industry. They weren't wearing tuxedos anymore. They had removed their jackets and ties. They were drinking heavily. The air was thick with smoke and a strange, electric anticipation. Senator Cornelius Vane sat in the center of the front row, sitting in a high-backed leather chair that looked like a throne. He beckoned Thomas to sit beside him. "Sit, my boy," Cornelius said. "Witness the machinery of the world." Thomas sat. His heart was hammering against his ribs. "What is this, Cornelius?" "This," Cornelius said, waving his hand at the room, "is the glue that holds civilization together. You think laws hold society together? You think voting booths matter? No. Power is held together by shared transgression, by the things we do in the dark that bind us to one another." He snapped his fingers. The lights on the stage brightened. Music began to play, a discordant, jarring jazz tune. From the wings of the stage, a line of women emerged. There were 50 of them. They weren't wearing gowns. They weren't wearing much of anything. They were dressed in elaborate, humiliating costumes, feathers, masks, sheer silks that hid nothing. But looking closer, Thomas realized these weren't strippers. He recognized some of them. That one. Wasn't she the debutante from the Greenwich fundraiser? That one, an aspiring actress he had seen in the papers. And there, a secretary from his own office. They looked terrified. Their eyes were wide, darting around the room, scanning the faces of the most powerful men in the state. "What is going on?" Thomas stood up, revulsion rising in his throat. "Sit down." Julian's voice cracked like a whip from behind him. Julian pushed Thomas back into the chair. "Watch." Cornelius stood up. "Gentlemen, the harvest is bountiful this year, but bounty must be earned. As is our tradition on All Hallows' Eve, we strip away the pretenses of civilization. We return to the primal." He reached into a large silver bowl next to his chair. He pulled out a handful of poker chips, but they weren't plastic. They were gold. Heavy, solid gold coins minted with the Vane family crest. He threw the coins onto the stage. They clattered loudly on the wooden floor. "Let the games begin," Cornelius roared. At his command, the other men in the room began to throw coins. Thousands of dollars in gold rained down on the stage, and then the order was given. The women were commanded to crawl, to scramble on their hands and knees to collect the coins. It was a scene of grotesque dehumanization, women in finery crawling like insects, fighting over gold, while the leaders of the free world laughed, cheered, and placed bets on who would gather the most. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. He looked at the governor, who was laughing red-faced, pointing at a woman who had tripped. He looked at the bishop, who was watching with a cold, detached fascination, sipping his wine. This wasn't a party. It was a ritual of dominance. It was a demonstration that these men owned everything, the law, the money, and the people. "Where is Lucinda?" Thomas grabbed Julian's arm. "Where is my wife?" Julian smiled. He pointed to the back of the stage. A curtain rose. Lucinda was there. She was sitting on a chair, still in her wedding dress, but the dress had been torn. The skirt was ripped away, revealing her legs. She was crying silently, tears ruining her makeup. She was watching the spectacle, forced to witness the degradation. And standing next to her was a man holding a camera. He was taking pictures, not of the women on stage, but of the men in the audience, and of Lucinda. "She is the witness," Cornelius whispered to Thomas. "She bears the burden of our truth. And now, so do you, Thomas." Cornelius turned to Thomas, his face hard as granite. "You want to be part of this family? You want the Senate seat I promised you? Then you must play. You must show us that you are not above the dirt." He handed Thomas a handful of gold coins. "Throw them," Cornelius commanded. "Make them crawl." Thomas looked at the coins. He looked at Lucinda. Her eyes met his across the room. She shook her head slightly, a tiny, desperate movement. "Don't do it." But Thomas looked around the room. He saw the security guards by the doors. He saw the glint of a gun under Julian's jacket. He realized with a sickening clarity that he wasn't a guest. He was a prisoner. If he refused, he wouldn't leave this room alive. He would be another sailing accident, another overdose. His hand trembled. He squeezed the gold coins until they bit into his palm. "Throw them," Julian hissed in his ear, "or I'll bring Lucinda down there to join them." That was the breaking point. The threat against her. Thomas stood up. He felt his soul fracture, a clean break down the middle. He raised his hand. And he threw the coins. The room erupted in cheers. "He's one of us. He's a Vane." Lucinda closed her eyes. She turned her head away. Thomas sat back down, hollowed out. He had survived the initiation. But he knew, as he watched the gold bounce on the stage, that Thomas Reed, the idealistic DA, had died in that chair. But the night wasn't over. The banquet was just the appetizer. At midnight, Cornelius silenced the room. The women were led away, clutching their gold, their dignity left on the floorboards. The room was cleared of the entertainment. Now it was just the inner circle, and the bride and groom. "The marriage must be sealed," Cornelius announced, "by the old laws, the laws of blood and soil." He looked at Thomas. "Take your wife to the chamber. We will wait here for the proof." "Proof?" Thomas stammered. "The sheet," Julian said, stepping forward with a smirk. "The blood. We need verification, Thomas. We need to know that the vein line remains pure, or at least purely yours." It was medieval. It was insane. But in the isolation of the eyrie, sanity was defined by the man with the most money. Thomas was led to the guest suite where Lucinda was waiting. The door was closed, but not locked. Outside, in the hallway, Julian stood guard with two men. Thomas entered the room. Lucinda was standing by the window, shivering. She looked at him. She saw the change in his eyes. She saw the shame. "You threw them," she whispered. "I had to," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "They would have killed us." "They've already killed us, Tom," Lucinda said. She walked over to the bed and sat down. "Do it. Let's get it over with. Give them their sheet. Give them their blood." She lay back, staring at the ceiling fresco, a painting of angels falling from heaven. She looked like a sacrifice on an altar. Thomas looked at her. He loved her, but looking at her now, he felt a surge of something else, something dark, something the veins had awakened in him: resentment, power, disgust. He realized he hated her. He hated her for being the trap. He hated her for being the bait. He approached the bed. Outside, the vain men waited, drinking their scotch, checking their watches, waiting for the signal that the corruption was complete. But Thomas didn't know that Lucinda had a secret she had kept from everyone, even Julian. Under the pillow, her hand was closing around a shard of glass, a piece of a broken perfume bottle she had smashed earlier. She wasn't planning to use it on Thomas. She wasn't planning to use it on herself. She was waiting for Julian to open the door to check on them, because Lucinda Vane was done being the pawn. Tonight, the queen was going to take the board. The bridal suite of the eyrie was designed to suppress sound. The walls were lined with heavy damask silk, the floors covered in Persian rugs thick enough to swallow a footstep, and the windows draped in layers of velvet that blocked out the moon. It was a room built for intimacy, but in the Vane household, intimacy was just another word for leverage. Thomas Reed stood by the door, his hand still resting on the brass knob. He could feel the vibration of the party downstairs through the soles of his shoes, a low, rhythmic thumping of the bass from the jazz band, like a heartbeat buried under the floorboards. He looked at Lucinda. She was sitting on the edge of the four-poster bed, the canopy casting a shadow over her face. Her wedding dress, torn and stained from the theater downstairs, looked like a molted skin. "They're waiting," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "Julian is right outside. If there's no proof." He couldn't finish the sentence. The shame was a physical object in his throat, choking him. He looked at the white sheet on the bed, the Vane tradition, the medieval requirement of blood to prove consummation. It was insane, archaic, and absolute. Lucinda didn't look up. Her hands were folded in her lap, hidden under the ruins of her tulle skirt. "You think they'll let us leave?" she asked softly. "After tonight, after what you saw?" "We're family now," Thomas said, trying to convince himself. Cornelius says a lot of things." Lucinda interrupted. She raised her head. Her eyes were dry. There was no fear in them anymore, only a cold, crystalline clarity. "My first husband, John, he saw the ledger. Just once. He thought it was a mistake. He asked Julian about it. 3 days later, he drowned in calm water. My second husband, he tried to leave. He packed a bag. They found him with a needle in his arm." She stood up. The movement was fluid, ghostly. "You aren't family, Thomas. You're collateral. You're just another account to be balanced." "So what do we do?" Thomas pleaded. He felt the trap closing around him. The walls seemed to be inching closer. "We balance the books," Lucinda whispered. She pulled her hand out from the folds of her dress. The light from the crystal chandelier caught the edge of the object she was holding. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a shard of glass, jagged and curved, broken from a heavy perfume bottle. It was about 4 inches long, sharp enough to split skin like a ripe peach. Thomas recoiled. "Lucia, put that down. If Julian comes in—" "He is coming in," she said. "He always comes in. He likes to watch the aftermath. He likes to verify." She moved toward the door. She didn't move like a victim. She moved like a spider settling into its web. She positioned herself against the wall just behind the hinges, in the blind spot of anyone entering. "Get on the bed," she commanded. "Get on the bed, Thomas. Take off your jacket. Loosen your tie. Look broken. Look like you've done what they forced you to do." Thomas stared at her. He realized then that he didn't know this woman. He had fallen in love with a fragile, sad socialite. He was now looking at a survivor who had been sharpening her edges for years. He obeyed. He sat on the bed, removing his tuxedo jacket. He messed up his hair. He tried to look like a man consumed by guilt. When he steps inside, Lucinda whispered, gripping the glass shard until her knuckles turned white, "Don't scream. Just close the door." They waited. The silence in the room stretched thin. Downstairs, the band was playing "I Put a Spell on You." The irony hung in the air, heavy and sweet. Then the handle turned. It didn't rattle. It turned slowly, silently. Julian Vane didn't knock. He owned the house. He didn't need permission to enter his own rooms. The door pushed open. Julian stepped in. He was holding a glass of scotch, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who has just watched the world kneel before him. He looked at Thomas on the bed. He grinned. "Done already, Tom?" Julian sneered, stepping fully into the room. "I expected a little more resistance. Or maybe you enjoyed it more than you the—" He never finished the sentence. Lucinda moved. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She lunged from the shadows behind the door, driving the shard of glass downward with both hands. She wasn't aiming for the chest. That would be too risky. Ribs could stop glass. She aimed for the soft tissue where the neck meets the shoulder, the trapezius, the jugular. The glass sank in. Julian made a sound that wasn't human. It was a wet, gurgling gasp. The scotch glass dropped from his hand, bouncing on the thick carpet without breaking, spilling amber liquid like a premonition of blood. He spun around, his hand flying to his neck. Blood, bright arterial red, sprayed across the white damask wallpaper. He looked at Lucinda. His eyes were wide, shocked. He couldn't believe it. The furniture had attacked him. The inventory had bitten back. "You!" He wheezed, blood bubbling between his fingers. He reached for her. Julian was strong, fueled by panic. He grabbed Lucinda by the throat with his uninjured arm, slamming her against the wall. The glass shard remained embedded in his neck. "Thomas!" Lucinda choked out. Thomas froze. He was watching a murder. He was watching his brother-in-law bleed out on the carpet. His brain was screaming at him to run, to call for help, to beg for mercy. But then he looked at Julian's face. He saw the pure, unadulterated malice. He realized that if Julian survived this room, Thomas Reed would not survive the night. Thomas moved. He grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the nightstand, a heavy Baroque piece that weighed 5 pounds. He swung it with all the desperate strength of a coward forced into a corner. Crunch. The brass hit the back of Julian's skull. Julian's grip on Lucinda loosened. His eyes rolled back. He crumpled to the floor, landing in a heap of black wool and red blood. Silence rushed back into the room louder than before. Then, Lucinda slid down the wall, gasping for air, rubbing the red marks forming on her neck. Thomas stood over the body, the candlestick shaking in his hand, blood dripping from the base. "Is he—" Thomas whispered. Lucinda crawled over to her brother. She didn't check his pulse. She reached into his pocket and pulled out a keyring. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice raspy. "Dead or alive, we have maybe 10 minutes before the guards wonder why he hasn't come back to brag." She stood up, wiping her bloody hands on her ruined wedding dress. The white silk was now streaked with crimson, transforming her into a gruesome parody of a bride. "We have to go." "Go where?" Thomas asked, panic rising in his voice. "The guards are at the front door. The police chief is downstairs drinking with your father." "Not downstairs," Lucinda said. She walked to the large, ornate fireplace. Inside, the area was built in 1920, during Prohibition. Cornelius Vane's father had been a bootlegger before he was a senator. The house was designed with secrets in mind. Lucinda reached inside the cold firebox and pulled a hidden lever disguised as an iron grate. The back of the fireplace clicked and swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage smelling of dry rot and cold stone. "The servants' tunnels," Lucinda explained. "They run behind the walls. They lead to the boathouse on the river." "Why do you know about this?" Thomas asked, staring into the darkness. "Because I used to hide in them," she said softly. "When Julian was angry, when Father was teaching us lessons. I hid, and I mapped them." She grabbed a box of matches from the mantel and pushed Thomas toward the hole. "Move, and don't sneeze." They climbed into the darkness. Lucinda pulled the grate shut behind them. The tunnel was claustrophobic. It was barely 2 feet wide, sandwiched between the limestone exterior of the house and the plaster interior walls. They could hear the hum of the house, the water in the pipes, the electrical buzzing. As they descended a narrow wooden ladder, the sounds of the party became clearer. They were passing behind the wall of the great hall. Through a small ventilation grate, Thomas looked out. He saw the scene below. It was surreal. Senator Cornelius Vane was standing on a table, holding a bottle of champagne, leading a toast. The governor was laughing. The crawling ritual was over, and the guests were now dancing, oblivious to the fact that the heir to the empire was bleeding out on a Persian rug 3 floors above. "Look at them," Thomas whispered, a mix of disgust and awe. "They have no idea." "They don't care," Lucinda hissed from below him. "Keep moving." They reached the basement level. The air here was damp, smelling of the river. The tunnel widened into a stone corridor used for moving kegs of liquor during the 20s. "We're almost at the exit," Lucinda said. "From the boathouse, we take the skiff. We go downriver to Terrytown. There's a payphone at the train station." It sounded like a plan. A fragile, desperate plan, but a plan nonetheless. But the Vane family didn't rely on luck. They relied on surveillance. As they reached the heavy iron door that led to the boathouse, Lucinda stopped. She pressed her ear against the metal. "Quiet," she commanded. She heard voices, not the party guests. These were sharp, professional voices. "Radio static. Sector 4, clear. Check the perimeter. Julian hasn't checked in. Dispatch 2 to the bridal suite." Lucinda pulled back. "They found him," she whispered. "Or they suspect something. The guards are sweeping the grounds." "We can't go out there," Thomas said. "If they catch us, they bury us," Lucinda finished. She looked around the damp corridor. Her eyes landed on a junction box on the wall, the main breaker panel for the west wing. "New plan," she said. "We need a distraction, a big one." She opened the panel. She looked at Thomas. "Give me your jacket." "Why?" "Just give it to me." Thomas handed her his tuxedo jacket. Lucinda wrapped it around the main bus bar, the thick copper strip that carried 200 amps of electricity to the ballroom chandeliers. "When I push this," she said, "it's going to arc. It's going to blow the main fuse, and it might start a fire." "Lucy, there are 200 people upstairs," Thomas said. "Those people watched me crawl for gold," she said, her voice devoid of mercy. "Let them sit in the dark for a while." She shoved the jacket against the contacts. Bzz crack. A blinding flash of blue light illuminated the tunnel. Sparks showered down. The smell of burning wool and ozone filled the air. Instantly, the hum of the house died. Above them, the music stopped. The great hall plunged into darkness. Screams of surprise, rich, entitled screams, echoed through the vents. "Run!" Lucinda yelled. She shoved the iron door open. They burst out into the night air. The fog was still thick, swirling around the boathouse like cotton wool. The sudden darkness of the estate worked in their favor. The floodlights were dead. The security cameras were dead. They sprinted across the wet lawn toward the river. The Hudson was black and oily, moving fast. But they weren't the only ones moving. From the shadow of the main house, a spotlight beam cut through the fog. It wasn't powered by the house. It was mounted on a jeep. The auxiliary generators had kicked in for security. "There," a voice shouted, "by the tree line." Gunshots cracked. Not warning shots. The dirt kicked up near Thomas's feet. "Into the maze!" Lucinda screamed, grabbing his hand. To the east of the house lay the Vane family's pride and joy. A 3-acre hedge maze, modeled after Hampton Court, with walls of yew 10 feet high and thick as stone. They dove into the entrance of the maze just as the jeep roared across the lawn. Inside, it was pitch black. The hedges blocked the wind, creating a silent, suffocating stillness. "Do you know the way out?" Thomas gasped, his lungs burning. Lucinda stopped, leaning against the prickly leaves. She was trembling again. The adrenaline was fading, leaving cold terror in its wake. I used to," she stammered, "but Father changed it. He replanted it last year. He said it was too easy." Thomas looked back toward the entrance. He could see flashlight beams dancing in the fog. He could hear the crunch of boots on gravel, and then a sound that made his blood freeze, the baying of hounds. Dobermans. The Vane estate had a kennel of them, trained not to hold, but to tear. They released the dogs, Thomas whispered. Lucinda looked at her bloody dress. They can smell the blood, she said. Julian's blood. My blood. She looked at Thomas. We can't outrun dogs in a maze, Tom. So we fight? Thomas asked, hefting a heavy rock he found in the dirt. No, Lucinda said. She looked up at the sky. The fog was glowing orange near the house. The short circuit hadn't just blown the fuse. It had ignited the insulation in the walls. The west wing was burning. Fire, Lucinda whispered. Fire confuses the dogs. The smoke ruins their scent. She looked at the hedge wall. It was dry yew, dense and brittle. Give me the matches, she said. Lucy, if you light this, we're trapped in here. We'll burn alive. Better to burn than to go back to that room, she said. She struck a match. The flame flared, small and fragile against the encroaching darkness. She held it to the dry underbelly of the hedge. The leaves caught instantly. A crackling sound, like breaking bones, began to spread. The fire climbed the wall of green, turning it into a wall of orange. Move deeper, Lucinda ordered. We heard the fire behind us. We use it as a wall. They ran deeper into the labyrinth, the heat rising at their backs. Behind them, the sounds of the dogs turned from baying aggression to confused whining. But ahead of them, in the center of the maze, something was waiting. The center of the maze wasn't an exit. It was a clearing. And in the clearing stood a statue of Saturn devouring his son. And standing next to the statue, holding a hunting rifle with a night vision scope, was Cornelius Vane. He wasn't in the house. He hadn't panicked when the lights went out. He knew his daughter. He knew where she would run. He had come out of the back way, bypassing the chaos to wait at the end of the game. He saw them emerge from the smoke, bedraggled, bloody, and desperate. Cornelius raised the rifle. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. Lucinda! His voice boomed, calm over the crackle of the fire behind them. You've made a terrible mess of my hedges. Lucinda stopped. Thomas froze next to her. Let us go, Father, Lucinda said. Julian is dead. It's over. Julian was clumsy, Cornelius said, shrugging. He always lacked vision. But you have spirit. I can work with spirit. He aimed the rifle at Thomas. Step away from him, Lucy, Cornelius commanded. Thomas has served his purpose. He delivered the coins. Now he pays the toll. Lucinda looked at Thomas. She looked at her father. She looked at the fire raging behind them, closing off the retreat. She was trapped between the fire and the patriarch. But Lucinda Vane remembered something about the maze that her father had forgotten. Under the statue of Saturn, there was a drainage grate, a storm drain that led directly to the river bluff. It was small, too small for a large man like Cornelius, but big enough for a girl who had spent her life shrinking to survive. She looked at Thomas. Her eyes said, "Trust me." "I'm sorry, Thomas," she said, loud enough for her father to hear. She stepped away from him. Cornelius smiled. "Good girl. Come here." Lucinda walked toward her father. She held her hands up, showing surrender. Thomas stared at her, betrayed. "Lucy?" Lucinda got within 10 feet of her father. The fire was roaring now, casting wild shadows. "I just wanted to make you proud, Daddy," she whispered. Cornelius lowered the rifle slightly, reaching out a hand to take her arm. "You will, my dear. We'll find you a new husband. Someone stronger." Lucinda smiled. It was the smile of the wolf in the trap moments before it chews its own leg off. "I don't need a husband," she said. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the matchbox. She threw the entire box into the pile of dry leaves at Cornelius's feet. At the same time, she screamed, "Thomas the Great!" The leaves at Cornelius's feet, soaked in the gasoline he had used to prime his waiting position, a precaution against the cold, ignited with a whoosh. Cornelius shouted, stumbling back, slapping at his burning trouser leg. The rifle fired wild, the bullet hitting the statue of Saturn. Thomas didn't hesitate this time. He tackled the grate, ripping it open. It was heavy iron, but adrenaline made it light as balsa wood. "Go!" Thomas yelled. Lucinda turned and ran back to him. They dove into the drain just as Cornelius, engulfed in the sudden flare-up, fired again. They slid down the concrete tube, tumbling into darkness, leaving the burning maze, the dead brother, and the screaming father behind them. They fell for what felt like forever. And then they hit water. Cold, freezing, black Hudson River water. They surfaced, gasping. They were outside the estate walls at the base of the cliffs. Above them, the area was ablaze. The fire from the maze had jumped to the stables. The west wing was glowing like a lantern. Thomas treaded water, holding on to a piece of driftwood. He looked at Lucinda. She was washing the blood off her face. "Is it over?" he asked, his teeth chattering. Lucinda looked up at the burning castle on the hill. She saw the sirens flashing in the distance. She saw the empire crumbling, if only for a night. "No," she said. "He's still alive, and as long as he's alive, we're hunting." She started swimming south toward the lights of Tarrytown. "Keep swimming, Thomas," she said. "The current is strong, but we're lighter now." The Hudson River in October is not water. It is liquid ice. It moves with a deceptive muscular current that has dragged tugboats under and hidden the bodies of mob informants for 50 years. For Thomas Reed and Lucinda Vane, bobbing in the black swell 200 yards from the burning shoreline, the river was the only thing cold enough to numb the burns on their skin and the horror in their minds. They drifted south, carried by the tide, clinging to a piece of driftwood that had washed out from the old pier. Above them, on the cliffs of the Palisades, the area was dying. The fire had consumed the hedge maze and jumped to the main house. The flames were reflected in the water, painting the river in strokes of violent orange and bruised purple. From the water, it looked like the gates of hell had finally opened to swallow the Vane dynasty whole. "Don't stop kicking," Lucinda whispered. Her teeth were chattering so hard the words sounded like grinding stones. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of her bondage, was now a heavy, sodden anchor trying to pull her down to the silt. She had torn off the skirt in the tunnel, but the bodice remained, tight and constricting. "I can't feel my legs," Thomas gasped. He was a lawyer, a man of courtrooms and country clubs. He wasn't built for survival. He was built for a world that no longer existed. "Tarrytown," Lucinda said, pointing a shaking hand toward a cluster of lights downriver. "The train station, there's a payphone, there's heat." It took them 40 minutes to reach the shore. They crawled out of the water onto a rocky beach near the train tracks, shivering uncontrollably, coated in river slime and the soot that was raining down from the sky. They didn't look like the golden couple of New York society. They looked like creatures birthed from a nightmare. They stumbled toward the station. It was 3 a.m. The platform was deserted. The station master was asleep in his booth. They broke into the waiting room, huddled against the radiator, and waited for the first train to Grand Central. Thomas reached for the payphone. His fingers were blue. "Who are you calling?" Lucinda asked. She was wringing out her hair, watching the door with the eyes of a hunted animal. "The police," Thomas said. "The FBI. We have to tell them. Julian, your father?" Lucinda walked over and hung up the phone. Her touch was gentle but firm. "Thomas," she said. "The police commissioner was in the front row. He caught the gold coin you threw. Who do you think he's going to believe? 2 hysterical half-drowned fugitives, or Senator Vane? But Julian is dead," Thomas argued. "We killed him. We can't just—" "Julian died in the fire," Lucinda said, her voice turning hard. "That will be the story. He died trying to save the guests. A hero. If we go to the police, we become his murderers. We become the lunatics who burned down a historic landmark. They will lock us in a hole so deep the sunlight will forget our names. So what do we do?" Thomas slumped against the wall, defeated. "We disappear," Lucinda said. "We die tonight, Thomas. Thomas Reed and Lucinda Vane drown in the river. That's the only way we survive." And she was right. The next morning, the headlines of the New York Times didn't scream murder. They screamed tragedy. "Inferno at the Eyrie. Senator Vane critical. Heir dead. Newlyweds missing." The official story, crafted by the Vane family's spin doctors before the embers were even cold, was a masterpiece of fiction. A gas leak in the West Wing. An explosion during the reception. Julian Vane, the heroic son, had rushed back inside to find his sister and her new husband. He had perished in the flames. The senator had been found near the stables, severely burned, attempting to aid the rescue efforts. As for Lucinda and Thomas, the river police found a piece of Thomas's tuxedo jacket snagged on a buoy near the George Washington Bridge. They dragged the river for weeks, but the bodies were never found. The Hudson keeps its secrets. But the truth of what happened to Cornelius Vane was far worse than death. Cornelius survived the fire in the maze, but the gasoline-soaked leaves had done their work. He had suffered third-degree burns over 60% of his body. His legs, fused by the heat, were useless. His vocal cords were scorched by the inhalation of superheated smoke. He spent the next 10 years of his life in a private wing of Mount Sinai Hospital and later in a wheelchair in the rebuilt guest house of the estate. He was a prisoner in his own kingdom. He couldn't speak. He could only write on a notepad with a trembling hand. He remained the senator in name only. His power was gone. Without Julian to enforce his will, without Lucinda to trade for alliances, the vain empire began to rot from the inside. The inner circle abandoned him. The men who had attended the gala stopped calling. They smelled weakness, and like sharks, they moved on to fresh water. Cornelius Vane died in 1984, alone, staring out a window at the overgrown ruins of his hedge maze. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the nurse who found him noted that he looked terrified, as if he had seen a ghost in the reflection of the glass. Perhaps he had, because Lucinda Vane didn't just disappear, she evolved. Thomas Reed couldn't handle the life of a ghost. He took the money Lucinda had stashed, cash she had been siphoning from household accounts for years, and went to Canada. He changed his name, became a high school history teacher in a small town in Saskatchewan. He married a librarian, had 2 daughters, and never spoke of New York. He died of a stroke in 2001, a quiet man who checked the locks on his doors 3 times every night. But Lucinda didn't want a quiet life. She wanted retribution. She moved to California. She became Alice Thorne. She didn't marry again. She invested the remaining money in real estate during the boom of the late 70s. She became wealthy, independent, and invisible, but she kept tabs. She hired private investigators. She tracked every man who had been in that room. The governor, the bishop, the CEOs. She didn't kill them. That would be too messy. She did something far more damaging. She leaked. Throughout the 1980s, a series of unexplained scandals rocked the New York establishment. The governor was caught in a bribery scheme involving construction contracts. The bishop was forced to resign after evidence of a slush fund surfaced. A prominent CEO was indicted for insider trading based on an anonymous tip sent to the SEC. Each time, the evidence arrived in a plain manila envelope. No return address. Just copies of ledgers, photographs, and transcripts. And in each envelope, there was a single, symbolic object, a dried chestnut. It was a message only they would understand, a reminder of the night they made women crawl for gold. A reminder that the witness was still watching. The final act of the drama played out in 2005. A young woman named Sarah Vane, the daughter of a distant cousin who had inherited the ruins of the Eyrie, decided to clear out the estate. She planned to sell the land to a developer who wanted to build luxury condos. During the demolition of the old boathouse, workers found a metal box hidden behind a false brick in the wall. It wasn't money. It wasn't jewelry. It was a roll of film. Sarah developed the film. It was grainy black and white, shot in low light. But the images were unmistakable. It was the gala, the women crawling, the men laughing. And in the center of the frame, her great-uncle Cornelius, holding a handful of gold coins, looking like a demon. And next to him, a young woman in a torn wedding dress, crying. Sarah Vane didn't burn the photos. She was part of a new generation. She took them to the New York Times. The story broke on a Sunday. The Shame of the Vanes. Photographs reveal decades-old ritual of abuse. It was the post-mortem execution of a dynasty. The Vane name, once plastered on libraries and hospitals, was scrubbed. The charitable foundations were dissolved. The legacy Cornelius had killed for was reduced to a cautionary tale of aristocratic rot. In a small house on the coast of Big Sur, California, an elderly woman sat on her porch reading the newspaper. Her hair was white, her hands gnarled by age, and the garden she tended. She read the article. She looked at the photo of her younger self, the girl in the torn dress. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in 30 years. She picked up a pair of scissors from her sewing basket. She carefully cut the photo out of the paper. She walked to the fireplace. She threw the clipping into the flames. She watched it curl and blacken the face of Cornelius Vane, disappearing into ash. "Checkmate, Daddy," she whispered. She walked out onto the porch, looking at the Pacific Ocean. The water was blue, vast, and endless. It was nothing like the Hudson. It was clean. They say that history is written by the victors, but in the case of the Vane family, history was rewritten by the survivor. Lucinda Vane didn't just escape a burning house. She burned down an era. She proved that while power can buy silence, it cannot buy forgetfulness. And some debts, no matter how old, are always collected in the end. The sound of a match striking. Then, silence.